Well, my guest tonight on As It Happens, the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum, Mahlase. Also joining us in our Cape Town studios is AmaBhungane investigative journalist, Karabo Rajuili. Thank you, ladies, for your time tonight. Thank you for coming into studio. Perhaps let's just begin more broadly. I mean, this report really goes into detail in terms of the experiences of individual case studies of journalists when it comes to spying and surveillance. Mahlatse, let me speak with you. What was it like for Sanef being able to receive this evidence? Of course, it's not the first time, but certainly the details that have been put together are in that way for the first time.
Yeah, we were not surprised, but we welcomed the report because what it then does is that, you know, we have had the conversations with journalists saying that I suspect that my phone is being tapped, somebody is listening to my communication. We know that during the Gupta leaks, when they were uncovered and reporters were working on those stories, a lot of media houses had to spend a lot of money on protecting the journalists because they were being followed, they were being intimidated, and of course, they did persevere in terms of going ahead with publishing those stories. But what this report does is then documents or gives evidence to how the reporters were actually being spied on, and it gives us an opportunity to say, but here is the evidence. We have seen that there has been state apparatus that have spied on the journalists, that have been there has been private sector that have listened and intercepted journalists' phone calls, and now we can actually have a conversation that is based on evidence. I know that a lot of the reporters have been a bit helpless because they will say, I suspect that my phone is being listened to. I can hear people in the background. We know that the people that we speak to are very wary of this. We've had cabinet ministers complaining that their phones are being tapped and they're being spied on. But now this gives concrete evidence, and it allows for this conversation to really now start in earnest, to say, there's one sector of society, and these are the journalists, and the consequences are quite dire, the fact that they're being listened to. What do we then need to do?
All right, and let's perhaps flesh it out a bit more. Karabo, let me bring you into this conversation. When she talks about the state apparatus and the private sector that's involved, let's begin with the state first. Who is watching, listening to these conversations?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Cathy. Who's watching or who's listening in on journalist phone calls? In various parties, in fact, but our Right2Know's main concern is around the various intelligence agencies, and this includes our State Security Agency, our Crime Intelligence Division, and other agencies who are empowered by our current laws to allow what is called the interception of communication. Now, this is enabled by our what is called the RICA law, which puts an obligation on our telecoms companies, so Cell C, MTN, Vodacom, to collect the information related to our call records. So our cell phone providers are under law required to collect all of the metadata related to our calls, and in the instance where the intelligence agencies get a warrant to listen in on the actual conversations themselves, the telecoms providers must both collect this information and hand it over by law. Now, one of the current problems with our RICA law is that this entire process happens in absolute secrecy. We as journalists, members of the public, simply don't know when your information is being handed over by your telecom service provider, if it's happened, and the reasons for it, which is a hugely problematic situation as it is right now.
And of course, one of the senior reporters at AmaBhungane, Sam Soul, is involved in this case, this court case that you're now pursuing. And we'll get to the court action in a moment. But if you can perhaps just put us into perspective here around how this monitoring and the surveillance has actually affected his life and what it looks like.
Yeah. Sam Soul, yes. So Sam Soul is one of the managing partners at AmaBhungane. And just to say, one of the patterns that we see in Right2Know's report is that when journalists have been working on stories, particularly as it relates to corruption, so holding power to account, they tend to be the targets of this type of communication surveillance. In Sam's situation, he at the time was working on a story related to former President Zuma's corruption charges, or what is now known as a spy tape saga. And at the time, he was in communication with a number of confidential sources to find out why the corruption charges were going to be dropped by the NPA at the time. During the course of investigation and collecting information to publish what is crucial stories for the public and really holding the president to account, some of the sources mentioned that we know that your phone is being tapped. And this is another one of the patterns, is that journalists sometimes find out that they're under surveillance simply because those who they're interviewing or those sources who happen to come to them will let them know, and that's the only way that they get any kind of information. So initially, and this is in 2008, 2009, initially what we've got in South Africa is an oversight body called the Inspector General of Intelligence, and this is what could be seen as a public protector against the spies in South Africa. And any member of the public, any journalist, can submit a complaint to find out if they've been under any kind of surveillance or had a warrant to have their communications put under surveillance. In the case of Sam Sol, AmaBhungane submitted a complaint to the Inspector General of Intelligence, and after this the complaint was investigated by the Inspector General, who's got the powers to pretty much open every single drawer in the intelligence agencies. So it's quite far-reaching powers that the Inspector General has. But the conclusion to this report was that there was insufficient, or there was inconclusive evidence of any type of surveillance taking place. However, when the DA later on got hold of the full record of the spy tapes in 2015, attached as an annexure to former President Zuma's application to the court was a transcript between Sam Sol and one of his confidential sources. And this, for us, provided the concrete evidence that not only was there suspicion of some kind of surveillance against Sam Sol during his investigative work, but that there was actual evidence of it, which allowed us to then submit a complaint based on actual evidence and launch what is now going to be a constitutional challenge to our RICA laws.
And of course, it's a flagrant abuse of the surveillance systems in our country, Mahlase. And part of what Right2Know has said is that they've put this report together because they want journalists to firstly have a better picture of what it is that the surveillance systems in the country look like, but also so that they're better able to defend themselves. Now, are media organizations in this country, are they fully aware of the threat that some of their journalists may be facing?
Before I answer that, Cathy, I think it's also important to highlight this point that we should not only be concerned around the journalists, but it's the whistleblowers. Journalists are able to write stories around the corruption because whistleblowers come to them, and they come to them with the trust that their identity would be protected. And they take that brave step to have the corruption exposed. And when journalists are then being spied on and being followed and all of that, it means that we are putting the whistleblowers' lives at risk. So this is an issue that concerns all of us as South Africans. It is a threat to media freedom, a threat to our constitution, a threat to the public's right to know, because when journalists are unable to protect their sources, then they would not have access to the information about what those in authority are doing with the powers that they have given them. So that is one thing to say. It's not just about the journalists. It's an issue that must concern all of us. And, you know, interestingly enough, there is this review of state agencies, and mainly, maybe it is because we've had ministers complain that they're also being spied on, but I think it's a welcome thing. All of us must then contribute because it's quite a worry for all of us. But I think that to answer your question around the media houses are very much aware. As I was saying, during the Gupta leaks, a lot of media houses spent a lot of money to protect their journalists. We also know that sources would say, you know what, I don't want to talk on the phone. We have to go back old school. Let's do one-on-one meetings. That's what needs to happen. We've had incidences where our reporters have said, you know, you arrive at those meetings and people are like, please, can you take out the battery from your phone? Can I see that it's actually switched off? And journalists sometimes also take those initiatives to protect their sources because they also realize that it is their job to actually protect the sources, and that is what allows us to do the journalism that we do, which is in the public interest. So media houses are very much aware, but also the Right2Know report says that everybody, all of the media houses should also come to the party. They must look at whatever softwares that are out there to ensure that their own systems protect the sources. And this part of releasing this report is to make everybody aware. And it's not just about mainstream media. It's also about community media as well, you know. But the reality is that not everybody will have the deep pockets to go through or to buy all of the necessary software. So what we need to do is then the reform. That is what we need to do. We need to have reform. We cannot have, in our democracy, journalists unable to do their work without fear or favor.
How far, sorry to interrupt you there, how far-reaching is this surveillance? And what I'm asking is that, is it limited to just the interception of phone calls or listening in on phone calls?
Not at all, Cathy. We have had journalists tell us that they've been followed to their homes. They've been followed to social gatherings. They've been followed while dropping off their kids, and they can see these cars. And as Karabo was saying, unfortunately, what happens is that they only find out when you have contacts in the intelligence sector where somebody actually tips you off. But sometimes, because journalists are aware of this, increasingly aware of this, they will see the cars that constantly are there wherever they are. So it is quite invasive. But also it is a form of intimidation because they're trying to shut you down. And if you look at all of the people in that report, these are people that have uncovered all sorts of corruption in this country. So it is aimed at silencing them, but also it is aimed at making sure that they know who the journalists are talking to, who they're getting the information from. And this is all about trying to cover up on corruption. And this is why it's such an abuse of the system. All
right. When we continue after the break, we will talk about this court challenge and the amendments and the changes that AmaBhungane, of course, and Sanef would want to see made in terms of the legislation. So do stay with us for that. You're watching As It Happens.